it's important to note that there is not one mainstream media organ that is pro-life. Not one. And therefore the mainstream media is an important opponent to the pro-life message, to contraception, to banning contraception. Therefore, in fact, it's important that we know how to deal with the media. Know thy enemy, remember, is one of the key things in both military strategy and life. And therefore, it's my very great pleasure in introducing an expert in this field, Father Nicolas Grace.
That's when we will begin this presentation in the way that we're going to end it with a prayer to the Blessed Queen. As we say, Hail Mary, full of grace, the Lord is with thee. Blessed art thou among women, and blessed is the fruit of thy womb, Jesus. Holy Mary, Mother of God, pray for us sinners now and at the hour of our death. Amen. Now, Paul VI, Humanae Vitae, reaffirmed Catholic teaching. It was written principally as a clarifying document, intending to explain what the Church teaches about contraception, in the media wave saying the contrary. It taught that contraception is not just wrong, but that because contraception is wrong, it would have bad consequences. These consequences were named to us by Father Linus in his presentation earlier on. They weren't meant to be prophetic, but they have become prophetic. Because what the Pope wrote before, the world is living today, clearly. To reiterate, the Pope predicted that contraception would lead to infidelity, lowering of morality, men treating women as instruments of selfish enjoyment, to a massive imposition of contraception by unscrupulous governments. These are facts. The Pope predicted that contraception would evolve from a lifestyle choice into what the Americans might call, he didn't say this, but what the Americans might call a weapon of mass destruction. This is evident because of population control, the promotion of abortion almost everywhere, sterilization in third world countries when the people don't even know about it half the time, forced abortion programs in China. All of these things prove that governments would take any unscrupulous efforts to decrease what they held as being population control. How did this happen, though? Why didn't people listen to the Pope? Why didn't the people listen? Why did the greatest ever dissent in the Catholic Church happen in this age, in this generation? There's many reasons. One is the fake news, which promoted overpopulation as a real threat to the world in the 1960s. Development organizations claimed that Humanae Vitae limited the methods available to fight worldwide population and the struggle against AIDS. Paul Ehrlich's book, The Population Bomb, stated, in the 1970s and in the 1980s, there will be hundreds of millions of people dying from starvation because of overpopulation. Now, the overpopulation scare at the time was attractive because the response was attractive. Tell the church to change her teaching on birth control. Simple. They were great bedfellows. However, less than half a century later, the overpopulation literature is now abandoned by serious thinkers and has been proved false. There's still the nut jobs in the United Nations and the 10 or 12 men sitting at the round table who are fixated on this idea. Rockefeller for one, Gates for another, and our old friend George Soros. Another reason, disobedient Catholics. They, in the name of a higher morality, argued that birth control could be defended as the lesser of two evils. But this is morally and philosophically unacceptable. Some, including well-known and relatively conservative journalist George Weigel, he observed that the Great Dissent was partly because of bad timing on the part of the Pope in releasing the document. Maybe it was, maybe it wasn't. This isn't the topic of my discussion today. I want to focus on these 2 points. The influence of the mass media promoting her worldly criteria, and really, which is my thesis, is that the Catholic leaders, being imbued with a far more worldly criteria than gospel criteria, decided to disobey the gospel, manifested to us through Pope Paul's teaching. Firstly, let us unmask the media a little bit. There are numerous of studies that illustrate television's powerfully damaging influence on adolescents' sexual attitudes, values, and beliefs. In film, television, music, sexual messages are becoming more explicit in their dialogues, in their lyrics, and in their behavior. Too often, these messages contain unrealistic, inaccurate, and misleading information that young people accept as fact. Many young people accept as fact. Adolescents have ranked the media second only to school sex education programs as leading sources of information on sex. Forget about what the priest says, forget about what your parents say. Television. What does Kim Kardashian say? What does David Beckham say? This is more important to them. What about the science? Heavy exposure to media sex is associated with increased perception of the frequency of sexual activity in the world. If they see lots of sex on the television, in the movies, they perceive that this is what we need to be doing in the world. Not always, but often. As a result, television can function as a kind of super peer, especially for adolescents, normalizing these behaviors and thus encouraging them among teenagers. I mean, very often young boys, they get the stupid haircuts that the footballers do, and the women, the girls, the young girls, dress very often as their reality TV star friends do. We see this all the time. They're influenced by these. These are their super peers. And it's unfortunate, but it's true. The science, though. Adolescents are particularly vulnerable to these messages because their cognitive skills that allow them to critically analyze the messages in the first place, to make decisions based on possible future outcomes, are not fully developed. Their cognitive skills as adolescents are not properly developed, therefore easily influenced and easily manipulated. Now, I'm not going to go mad with statistics. We'll just have a page or two of statistics and we'll move on. Analyses of US broadcast media. Teenage viewers see, on average, 143 incidents of sexual behavior on prime time every week. 3 to 4 times as many sexual activities occurring between unmarried partners as between spouses. Watch your next 5 Hollywood movies and see if there's a divorced couple in it, or a separated family, or a broken up family. You see it all the time. Nearly 1/3 of the so-called family primetime TV, 8 to 9 in the United States, contains sexual references, which is more than 4 times from what was in sexual references in 1976. 50 hours of daytime soap operas. You'll never hear me stop preaching about the evils of soap operas. Muck. If you watch Coronation Street, EastEnders, any of these things, forget it. Bad messages. In the United States, the famous Mexican soap operas, 50 hours of daytime soap operas found that unmarried partners outnumbered married partners by 3-1. Analyses show that sexual messages on television are almost always presented in a positive light with little or no discussion about the potential risks of premarital sex. Result, premarital sex to beat the band. They see it on television, they see it as normal, and they do it. Because the television is their super peer. Finally, exposure. American children spend more than 38 hours a week using media, television, music, movies, social media, computer games. Even the computer games are perverted now. By the time the adolescents graduate from high school, this is a shocking fact, they will have spent 15,000 hours watching television and 12,000 hours in the classroom. So I ask you, who is the greater educator of the child? The television, the parent, or the school teacher? However, what kind of things does the media say in the context of today's topic, Humanae Vitae? Does the media present to us a rational, fair, objective journalism? My sister's a journalist, a good journalist. She'll tell you no. It's almost always subjective, ideological, and emotive. I'll give you some examples of this later if you want. What I've done here is I've selected a typical article which reflects the behavior of the mass media in this topic. Basically, I'm going to read to you the nuts and bolts of this article, and I just want to see heads nodding. I want to see heads going, yes, this is the kind of stuff that we're always exposed to. This is what we read in our Sunday newspapers. Watch out for the sophisms, watch out for the emotive arguments, watch out for the church bashing. We're going to use the flagship Irish newspaper, the Irish Times. Father James Good is 94. He's an old man. I already feel sorry for him. He's retired in his beloved Cork. It is still not clear whether he can carry out his priestly faculties there. Of course it's clear. He knows exactly whether he can or not. He was suspended from saying Mass publicly, from preaching and other duties 50 years ago. As professor of theology and lecturer in general philosophy in University College Cork, he had publicly opposed Humanae Vitae. Father Good was an optimist fueled by the insights of Vatican II. But then the 16th century hit back, and old authority was on top once more. Pope Paul VI, God love him, lost his nerve and published Humanae Vitae. Few expected it in the new, refreshed, post-Vatican II Church, where authority was to be exercised collegially by agreement rather than diktat. That's a sophism. Pope Paul was an anxious man, ignored the recommendations of a commission set up by John Paul XXIII in 1963 to address the use of artificial means of contraception in the context of Catholic teaching. That's a lie. A minority report signed by just 6 members of the commission said the Church should not and could not change its teachings on the matter. Paul concurred and confirmed, as we are frequently reminded, that the Church is not a democracy. He and the minority ruled. I mean, I read this and I don't like the Church. I don't like the Church. It killed the spirit of Vatican II and split the Church between liberals and conservatives. This is dialecticism. The fiercely negative reaction to Humanae Vitae was not lost on Pope Paul over the remainder of his papacy. He remained deeply troubled by it until his death in 1978. This is insinuating that he was deeply troubled by having made a bad decision. No. He was deeply troubled by the fact of all those people who rejected his decision. He was deeply troubled about worrying where their souls were going to go. But the article tries to trick us. In the main, Humanae Vitae was ignored by most Catholic women as common sense prevailed over dogma. As former President of Ireland, Mary McAleese, this is called an argument of authority. She was the president, she must know what she's talking about. My generation largely rejected Humanae Vitae's ban on artificial contraception, and along with it, magisterial control over family size, emotion. Our small families testify to that. All over the world, good, decent, faith-filled men and women are infantilized and robbed by Humanae Vitae of their God-given right and obligation to make sensible decisions regards family life. Humanae Vitae has been a stumbling block to the faithful, detrimental to family life, an impediment to women's health and well-being for nearly 50 years. I mean, give me the document, I want to burn it. Back to Father Good. He didn't agree with Humanae Vitae and said so publicly, and it cost him. He was summoned by the then Catholic Bishop of Cork to bend and kneel. He did not. Father Good is now retired at Douglas in Cork. Later this year, he will celebrate 70 years a priest. It is an anniversary he is more likely to celebrate than 50 years of Humanae Vitae. Congratulations, Father Good! This is how the article finishes. Friends, I wonder if this type of article sounds familiar to you, whether you agree with me in calling it the regular, populist, agenda-driven, emotive, media manipulation by which many of the unsuspecting sheep have, in the past and now in the present, are being misled. However, Father Good was a dissenter. That's what we call him. He was a dissenter. A dissenter that the mass media promoted as a hero. But Father Good is not the only one, and certainly not the worst, certainly not the most dangerous dissenter. Certainly not the most destructive dissenter. Let's now move on to our second cause for which Humanae Vitae was rejected by the public. That is, the churchmen who, being led far more by worldly criterion rather than gospel criterion, led the faithful to unfaithfulness. Let us start with the story of Father Charles Curran. As you know, 25th of July 1968, Humanae Vitae is signed by Pope Paul VI. Released on the 27th, presented to the media in Rome on the 29th. On the 30th is the coup de théâtre. What am I talking about? 30th of July, the coup de théâtre happens. This proves that the dissident theologians fully understood the power, the capacity of using the mass media against this doctrine, of using the media to aid and abet them in their revolution. The Catholics of the United States are the first to be informed that large numbers of the most distinguished theologians of the West held that the people had the right, in conscience, to set aside the Pope's teaching on moral questions without calling into doubt their own membership of the Catholic Church. From this carefully organized campaign have issued most of the troubles which have disturbed the Church over the last 40, 50 years. How, though, did Charles Curran and his associates undertake this villainy? Baltimore's now deceased Cardinal Lawrence Sheehan records exactly how it happened. After receiving the news of the publication of the Encyclical, Father Charles Curran, instructor of moral theology in the Catholic University of America in Washington, met with 9 other theological professors by pre-arrangement with the Washington Post. They met to dissect the Encyclical part by part as it came off the press. We're in 1968. At 9 o'clock, they had received it, read it, analysed it, and criticised it, and put together a 600-word statement of dissent. The Washington Post remembers that they spent until 3:30 a.m. in the morning calling theologians from all around the United States to consent to have their names attached to this statement. They succeeded in getting 89 theologians to attach their name to the statement without reading the statement of dissent or the encyclical written by the Pope. Scandalous. Father Curran also managed to get the statement, and him and his associates reading it out on national television. Nothing like an organized public dissent from papal teaching had ever occurred like this in American Catholicism. Later, 600 other theologians would attach their name to this dissent. That's a lot of authority. Father Curran, though, you see him on the right as a young revolutionary priest, and you see him now as a barred theologian. He's not allowed to be a Catholic theologian anymore. But the man's also a liar. To this day, he claims that the dissent was a spontaneous response. It wasn't organized, it wasn't planned. However, Father Curran forgets what he wrote in his book, Loyal Dissent, in 2006. And there it is in front of you. He recounts exactly the events. It's rumored that the Pope's Encyclical was going to be released. I consulted my colleagues and others around the country about how we should respond to the Encyclical. It was my view that we theologians should issue a statement disagreeing with the Encyclical if it proved to be as negative as we expected. Clearly premeditation and not spontaneity. Question: was Pope Paul VI so ingenuous as to think that Humanae Vitae would be received by everyone with approval, even knowing that there were rebellious, self-willed, and intransigent corrupters of the faith known to be in the ranks of the Church? Was he so ingenuous? Clearly not. He states it in the document itself. Read it. It is to be anticipated that perhaps not everyone will easily accept this particular teaching. But it comes as no surprise to the Church that she, no less than her divine founder, is destined to be a sign of contradiction. She does not, because of this, evade the duty imposed on her of proclaiming humbly but firmly the entire moral law, both natural and evangelical. However, perhaps what the Pope did not expect was such tremendous dissent from bishops, those who are meant to conserve and protect the faith, and from even entire bishops' conferences. Let's now have a look at a few of these players. Of course, our pals in Germany, the dying church. The church that is dying, the church that tries to keep telling us how we're meant to be running the church, even though their church is dying. What did they say? Individual consciences should prevail in such personal and private issues as family planning. The Americans weren't so bad. Their pastoral letter, Human Life in Our Day, contained a strong defense of Humanae Vitae, but it laid out licit norms for dissent. Now, the licit norms for dissent weren't tremendously scandalous, but there is one particular that's a bit of a no-brainer and open up to abuse. It says, expression of dissent is in order only if the reasons are serious and well-founded, if the matter of dissent does not question or impugn the teaching authority of the Church, and is such as not to give scandal. Well, of course it impugns the teaching authority of the Church. That's what dissent does. And wait till you see how it impugned the teaching authority of the church in the next few slides. Belgian bishops. Someone who is competent in the matter under consideration and capable of forming a personal, well-founded judgment, which necessarily presupposes a sufficient amount of knowledge, may, after a serious examination before God, come to other conclusions on certain points. In such a case, he has the right to follow his conviction that he remains sincerely disposed to continue his inquiry. It's excusing the person from dissenting. Of those who arrived at different conclusions were certainly our old pals in Scandinavia. Look at their church now, probably the most dead of all. No one should therefore, on account of such diverging opinions alone, be regarded as an inferior Catholic. Again, permitting them to make the dissent. However, if there was any doubt that Catholics could dissent from this teaching, Canada is the leader. They met in 1968, and the Bishops' Conference voted 94 bishops against 7 to accept the infamous Winnipeg Statement. This statement is tremendous. It essentially absolved Catholics from dissenting from the Pope's teaching against contraception. Winnipeg was championed by unfaithful bishops to the faithful, with so much damage that we can compare the diffusion of the Winnipeg Statement as to the spread of a dangerous virus. The message of Winnipeg was seized upon by dissenters of many countries to justify their rebellion. 3 million copies of Anthony Wilhelm's book, strangely called Christ Amongst Us, quoted paragraph 26 of the Winnipeg Statement. And this was circulated all throughout the English-speaking world until the Vatican had the bishop's imprimatur removed. This paragraph, paragraph 26, is the one which gives to a higher level, a higher authority, the person's conscience over the teaching of the church. What's the problem here? It's all very well to follow your conscience. However, your conscience has to be well informed. What happens, though, from media manipulation, from getting bad advice from priests, and many other factors, is that we deform our conscience, and then we end up making bad decisions. The conscience is not over the teaching authority of the church. That's why we have the teaching authority of the church, to save us from making those bad decisions when our conscience has been badly formed, or we are emotionally involved. Because as you know, the emotions and the passions cloud our judgment. Sebastian there is a professional moralist, a teacher of ethics. He knows this as well as I do, right? Clouds our judgment. As you know, this doctrine of the conscience being the most important thing has made a great comeback recently, and it's making a comeback in the most highest places. For example, Cardinal Archbishop Cupich of Chicago. He is sending out his disciples all around the world to preach this doctrine. They've been to the diocese in Liverpool, to Newcastle. They tried to get into Edinburgh, but were rejected from a lot of places. But I found a church in my own deanery where they were preaching this conscience doctrine. Parish priest didn't even turn up. But there he was, there they were in his parish, teaching all this stuff. Just the conscience, just the conscience. If your conscience tells you, okay, it's okay. Let yourself go. No, this is incorrect, misleading. The text, Path Through Catholicism by Mark Link, XJ, again, endorsed this false notion of conscience based on the Winnipeg Statement. The famous article entitled Formation of Conscience with Birth Control as an Example by Kenneth Overbury, another Jesuit, is still widely circulated in parishes, even though it was written in the mid-1980s. You know all about the recent Synod on the Family. Well, in the 1980s, they had a crack at this as well. Cardinal Basil Hume of England, he insisted that those who experience the sacrament of marriage constitute an authentic theological source. Okay. But then when he teamed up with the Archbishop of San Francisco at the time, John Quinn, they noted that many men and women of goodwill do not accept the intrinsic evil of every use of contraception. This conviction is shared by a majority of priests. It's not shared by me. Is it shared by Father Linus? Who do they think they are, putting themselves in their shoes for the majority of priests? Who do they think they are? It's shared by a majority of priests and theologians whose learning, faith, and discretion and dedication to the church are beyond doubt, apart from the fact that they're going against the head of the church, the Vicar of Christ on earth. Bit of a no-brainer there. John Paul II, he says the opposite. He states to a conference on responsible procreation, the Church's teaching on contraception does not belong to the category of matter open to free discussion among theologians. Teaching the contrary amounts to leading the moral consciences of spouses into error, deforming their consciences. Pope John Paul II, he tied this teaching into the central truths of the faith in the realm of God's goodness. And of course, he was fought against in a famous document called the Cologne Declaration, where there was a protest by 163 theologians. And guess where they came from? Germany, Holland, Austria, Switzerland, dead churches. I mean, why do we listen to these guys? I don't listen to them. Now, an example of what one of these might have said as an individual can be presented to us by the famous, in liberal circles, Karl Rahner, but in conservative circles, the infamous Karl Rahner. What are contemporary moral theologians to make of Roman declarations on sexual authority, sexual morality, that they regard as too unnuanced? Are they to remain silent? Or is it their task to dissent, to give a more nuanced interpretation? I haven't put down the answer because I wanted to give you a bit of suspense. Rahner's response is unhesitating. I believe that the theologian, after mature reflection, has the right and many times the duty to speak out against the teaching of the magisterium and to support his dissent. And this is the super genius, the super theologian. This is the one that so many bishops and priests now, who are a bit older than me, are following. Karl Rahner, Jesuit. Friends, coming towards the end, the betrayal of truth by clerics very often continues. On the day the Charter of the Rights of the Family of St. John Paul II was to go to press, it was found that in certain hierarchies, the section on the parent, the primary educator, had been removed. And the section aid to third world countries not being contingent on population control had also been removed. The Pope found out from Cardinal Edward Gagnon, and he was able to replace this information in the documents. But that someone from inside would remove what he himself had written is scandalous. Scandalous. That says that there have to be people on the inside who are actually friends of International Planned Parenthood Federation. Finally, some consequences of negative and heretical reactions to Humanae Vitae. Lack of priests. Many Catholics complain now that we have Catholic schools that are closing. Catholic schools that don't have a lot of Catholics in them. Parishes that are closing or clustering together. We've no priests, they complain. Yeah, but the problem is that many of these Catholics have contracepted themselves out of existence. And this is one of the consequences. This is one of the consequences. Secondly, the whole Humanae Vitae affair quickly established quite firmly in the minds of many people in the church the proposition that the church could err, that the magisterium could make mistakes. The Pope might reaffirm Catholic traditional teaching as solemnly as he liked, but it was nevertheless widely seen as simply being wrong about birth control. Worse yet, if the church was wrong, dissent was not only permitted, it was imperative. Here's the bigger problem, though. Dissent becomes almost universal, trendy, something that we should be doing. This is the conclusion to the proposition. If the Pope and the Church's magisterium could be in error about contraception, then they could surely be in error about many other teachings. We remember, in many quarters it was in vain when the Pope declared that the teaching forbidding female ordination was to be definitively held by all the faithful. In vain did he teach that. In vain did the CDF, the Congregation for the Doctrine of the Faith, insist that this non-ordination teaching actually belonged to the deposit of the faith. In vain were the words of many Catholics when Pope John Paul II solemnly condemned abortion and euthanasia in his Encyclical in 1995, Evangelium Vitae. In vain. So often does the Pope speak. People don't care what he has to say because they don't think it's infallible anymore. A couple more consequences. Faithful Catholics might worry when they hear that dissent is being promoted at the highest levels. Faithful Catholics might need to worry when they hear that there's a new birth control commission with the charge to reinterpret Humanae Vitae's teaching through the light of Amoris Laetitia. Faithful Catholics might be worried when they hear that heading the four-man commission is Monsignor Gilfredo Marengo, a bitter critic of Humanae Vitae, who says Humanae Vitae is a too abstract theological ideal on marriage. This is the new fashionable word, that the gospel, that the teaching of the church, that the teaching of Christ is an ideal. It's not an ideal. This is the teaching of our Lord Jesus Christ. Catholics might be worried and concerned when they hear that the St. John Paul II Institute for Studies on Marriage and the Family was redesigned into a new institute, and that its president, Monsignor Pier Angelo Sequeri, no friend of Humanae Vitae, is also a member of the four-man commission. I mean, the odds are stacked against it. This is shocking. This is shocking. This is exactly what they do in Ireland with the abortion referendum. Let's set up a commission to see whether we should have a referendum. Who are all the players on the commission? They're all people that want abortion. Catholics, faithful Catholics, might worry when they hear that Father Chiodi is also a member of the Commission. Father Chiodi, who tells us that in situations where natural methods are impossible or impracticable, other forms of responsibility need to be found. What other forms of responsibility? Contraception. The problem is that Father Chiodi and these guys that I've mentioned never say how we determine whether obedience to a norm is impossible or impractical, whilst presenting their form of reasoning as new, pastorally far-sighted, as a great improvement over the rigidity of the old traditional church, when in fact their so-called new far-sighted doctrine is nothing more than the old teaching of justifying evil doing for the sake of achieving good. The ends justify the means. But the church has rejected this all the way back to St. Paul, Romans chapter 3. Last page. I wanted my overarching point in this presentation to be that essentially these people, these dissenters, have been imbued with the worldly principles of the mass media to the point that the gospel criterion become completely obfuscated. I don't want to attribute to them malice, just foolishness, blindness, being blinded by the media, eating up everything that the world is giving to them. And I hold this as the cause for their unfaithfulness. I want you to know, though, that there's still hope as long as the likes of, for example, Cardinal Gerhard Müller, Prefect Emeritus of the CDF, are still around to fight our battles for us. Cardinal Müller, for example, recently said this after hearing what Father Chiodi had said in his public conference in the Gregorian University in Rome. He said, directing his words at Chiodi, attempts to change the Church's teaching and to put in contrast the last three pontificates with the pretext of imposing a heterodox teaching to the faithful is a crime against the Church and a betrayal of her mission and mandate, whose final task is that of preserving the faith authentically inherited from the apostles. As you know, Cardinal Burke is also doing his best. I'd like to conclude, though, now in a little bit of a different motivation. I'd like to speak to you about two contraries, about the facts and falsehoods, about the truth and about empty words. This conclusion is not directed at 99% of the people here. It's directed at 1%. Those who are sitting on the fence, those who have come for the first time to an event like this, or those who might be here that actually are against Humanae Vitae, are for abortion, are for these things. Facts and words. Words that most of us are fed up with. Words which are welcomed in a world which is anti-family, anti-life, anti-natural. Words which are presented to us so that we are sick to death of hearing about births and control, rights and regulations, about pseudoscience and so-called impossible situations. Words that are presented to us from unworthy sources. Worldly priests, cowardly bishops, unfaithful theologians, catechists who don't know what they're talking about. Words that are welcomed by instruments of propaganda, the playthings of a few rich men, which for some reason we still call newspapers, news programs. So many perverse, empty, false words. Most of us, at one point or other, started to listen to our hearts. For it is in the heart where we can distinguish the difference between right and wrong, between real facts and false words. Did contraception give to women that stability, that commitment that they so desired from men? No. It gave many men before and today the opportunity to shirk their responsibilities, to deny commitment to those very women who sought their commitment. The marriage rates now are lower than they've ever been. These are facts, not words. Did contraception stop the spread of the AIDS epidemic and sexually transmitted diseases as it promised? No, it did not. Sexually transmitted diseases are through the roof. They've never been so high in Britain. In countries like Uganda, where they decided to use the promotion of chastity rather than contraception, they have much less problems of sexually transmitted diseases than places like Thailand, where they did promote contraception. These are facts, not words. Contraception, friends, is, as we all know, and as we've heard today, the primary cause for the greatest shame of this generation, the greatest shame for every generation in the history of the world. I'm talking about the murderously bloody, worldwide massacre of little children by their own parents, misled by the very people who should have been directing them. Little babies with little hands and little ears and little eyes and fully formed bodies and little beating hearts, called lumps of flesh, denied their personhood and murdered. Shame on them. And woe to the doctors who misled them. These are facts, not words. We have the science to prove it. Pope Paul VI tried to stop this. He was mocked. He was ridiculed. He was laughed at with words. Yet Pope Paul VI is counted amongst the most blessed of the Church's sons. This is a fact. Theirs are the words. That's all I wanted to do, is present the facts. Facts to discern in our hearts. Facts to place in the hearts of others. Facts with which we can fight the fight, but not, as it were, against enemies, but against brothers. Because if we do not overcome them with the facts, we will overcome them with our love. May the blessed Queen of Heaven help us in this undertaking. Mary Immaculate, Queen of heaven and of earth, of angels and of saints and sinners alike, be our mother, be our teacher. Save us from the tricks of the deceiver. Son and the Holy Spirit. Amen.